Welcome back. In this segment of Lecture 12, we're going to focus on forgetting, or as they say back in New Jersey, forget about it. Sorry, I spent 23 years as a professor at Rutgers University, so the New Jersey lingo still hangs on. But forget about it. Well, why do we forget? Why does it happen? Well, there are a lot of different examples or reasons we forget, and I'm going to go through a few of them here. So, when we talked about memory stages, we talked about, you got to get information into your memory, and then you have to store it there, and then you have to get it out when you need it, right? Well, logically, it follows that if you don't encode information or store information, if the information doesn't get into your long-term memory, then you're not going to remember it. And what doesn't get into your long-term memory? Well, stuff that's unimportant. Completely unimportant. So we don't encode information that's unimportant to us, and we also don't encode information that we don't pay attention to. And a lot of times those are the same thing, right? You don't pay attention to the stuff that's unimportant. But I want to give you an example of a situation in which you have seen something literally thousands of times, but what you saw, the details of what you saw didn't really matter, and as a result of that, you didn't encode it. So what do I have here? I have 15 different drawings of a penny, an American penny. And my question to you is, which of these drawings is accurate? Which one correctly indicates where the different parts of a penny are? So for example, is Abraham Lincoln facing to the left or to the right? What does it say above Abraham Lincoln's face? Where's the date? Is there something else written there? Now, again, you've seen pennies, if you live in the US, thousands of times. So go ahead, pick out the penny that's right. It should be obvious, right? You've seen it thousands of times. It's not obvious at all, is it? It's not obvious at all. How is it possible that something we've seen so often we can have no memory of? Okay, take a guess. What do you think is the most likely accurate depiction of a penny? Yeah, it was A. Right? So A was correct, is the correct penny, and the other 14 pennies are completely wrong. So why don't we remember what a penny looks like? Because in a lot of ways it doesn't matter. It's the only coin we have that's copper on the outside, or at least copper looking. And we know it's got Lincoln on it, but other than it's got some stuff written on it, but where everything is, who cares whether Lincoln is facing to the left or the right, or whether the date is on the left or the right side of Lincoln's bust? It doesn't matter. So we don't remember it. Okay? So you can only remember things that you pay attention to and are important. So just because something's presented in class doesn't mean you're going to remember it. You have to take that thing and make it meaningful to you. You have to pay attention to it, and you have to make it meaningful. Okay. Why do I keep harping on meaning? Why do I think meaning is so important? Well, I'm going to tell you about a really old study that shows how bad your memory is for things that aren't meaningful. This was a set of studies done by a man named Hermann Ebbinghaus. He was a German psychologist who did really important memory research. He only used himself as a subject. But here's his classic Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. That's what we're going to get to. So what did Ebbinghaus do? Well, he memorized lists of nonsense syllables. So nonsense syllables would be like a consonant, vowel, consonant, but not something like CAT that spells cat. It would be, a nonsense syllable might be, I don't know, XZT. Hopefully that doesn't spell anything. Things that that lack meaning. So he would memorize these lists of meaningless syllables until he had them perfectly memorized. And how would he do that? Not by adding meaning, but by studying the way that most students study. Rehearsing it over and over and over again, reading it over and over and over again, writing it down over and over and over again until he could write it down perfectly. Okay? Now, normally in class, what I do is I read a list of nonsense syllables, like the syllables I have up on the screen now, and then wait a little while and ask people to recall the list later. I'm not going to do that today. Imagine, though, that you did it. What I'm going to show you now is the forgetting curve, Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. And what I want you to see about this curve is that how much you remember when the material is meaningless. Even though you've remembered it perfectly just a moment ago, your memory drops like a rock in the first hour or so. Really, you lose half of it in the first 20 minutes. And then once you get down to about 2 days, it sort of levels off and you remember about a quarter of it. But students, I need you to think about this because I think of Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve as a cramming curve. And by that I mean, I've been in your shoes. I know what it's like trying to memorize something that you don't really understand. It's hard, right? So you don't understand it, so you can't work to understand it more deeply. You're lost. So you just try to memorize, right? Stay up late trying to memorize the content for an exam. Then you walk into your exam and all that work you've done, it just goes poof, right? It just disappears. Why? Because of this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. That's why. So again, the curve starts off at 100% because Ebbinghaus memorized the list until he could reproduce it perfectly. And then he would wait 20 minutes and then attempt to reproduce the list again. And in 20 minutes, he lost almost half of what he had learned, right? Within an hour, he's lost more than half. Within a day, you're down to losing 75% of it. So the reason, if you memorize things that don't have meaning for you, and then walk into an exam and your mind goes blank, is because of this, because of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to understand the material. But if you don't, and if you insist on cramming, memorizing stuff you don't understand, then as soon as the professor hands out the exam, everything you're trying to remember, write it down. Because it's going to be gone in a matter of minutes, so write it down before it disappears. It's the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So Ebbinghaus's research tells us that for you to remember something, it has to be meaningful to you. If it's not meaningful to you, you're not going to remember it. So what do people do? Well, they come up with tricks, sometimes called mnemonic devices, but essentially tricks to help them add meaning to things that aren't otherwise meaningful. So for example, I can easily remember the colors of a rainbow, which is also the same as the order of the different wavelengths, by remembering the name Roy G. Biv. I've never met anyone named Roy G. Biv, but it's a reasonable name. And it's enough to remind me that the colors in a rainbow go red, orange, yellow, Roy. G is green, and then Biv, blue, indigo, violet. Or if you have to remember the order of the planets, right? That seems sort of arbitrary. It doesn't have a lot of meaning if you're just doing a superficial class. But if you remember my very excellent mother just served us nachos, and you take the first letter in each of those words, then you can remember, okay, my, Mercury, very, Venus, excellent, Earth, mother, Mars, etc., etc. Okay? So if a material doesn't have meaning, you have to add it. All right, I want you to compare this graph with the Ebbinghaus graph. Now, the graphs look the same, right? Very steep drop, and then it levels off. But I want you to notice the horizontal axis. In Ebbinghaus's horizontal axis, we're talking about minutes, and then hours, and then days. This horizontal axis goes up to 50 years. 50 years. What's the difference? Well, this is a study, this forgetting curve is a forgetting curve for people who had studied Spanish. And then they came back, these researchers, talk about Herculean researchers, right? They tested people 3 years, 5 years, 9 years, 15 years, 25 years, and almost 50 years after they had taken a Spanish class. They tested people's memory for Spanish that they had learned in that class. And you can see the drop is rapid. There's a lot of forgetting at first, and then it steadies off. But the axis is very different. 50 years is very different from 50 days. And that difference comes from studying meaningful material versus non-meaningful material. Okay, that's it. See you back here in a sec.